Okay, Chairman Garrett is en route from upstairs, so that doesn't mean he's on the roadway. He's in the building and he's en route, and we'll try to get started. For some of you, it'll be a little later than we were supposed to. For others, a little earlier than we were supposed to. We do have Chancellor Baker first up to bat, and then we'll roll into the presentation by the LFO, Mr. Fulford, and the Finance Director, Mr. Poole. So when Chairman Garrett gets here, we will, in all likelihood, start off.
How are you?
All right, I'm informed that Chancellor Baker's post-secondary presentation about ACCS will be on the website, as will Mr. Fulford's, and then Mr. Poole's will be on subsequent to his talk today. So we have members here. If you want to come up just to the dais here or whatever, you're welcome to, or sit where you are. Chairman Garrett, any opening comments?
No, sir. I think a few members aren't aware of the early start, but they'll catch up.
So they'll catch up. All right. So it's just a few minutes early if you're thinking 9:30, and a few minutes late if you're thinking 9 o'clock. So Chancellor Baker, please, good to see you out and out of the hospital and recuperating, and glad to have you with us today. And take it away. And you're welcome to go past 9:30. So take 20 minutes or whatever you need.
I can do it in less.
Oh, I'm sure you could. You can filibuster us for 8 minutes, can't you?
But I do appreciate the courtesy of acknowledging that I could not make the meeting when it was originally scheduled. I was taking care of an old injury that occurred at Fort Pope, Louisiana, when I was in basic training in the Army. I shouldn't have waited as long as I did, but at least it's now accomplished and I'm recovering. But I do appreciate your courtesy. I'd sit here and change my mind 3 times about what I want to talk about. I know this is basically about money, but it's bigger than that. It's about students. It's about individuals. It's about businesses in the state. And how can we provide a way to assist those businesses in their pursuit of hiring and employing people that are productive? And so we are doing some things that I think are quite unique and novel for education. I just want you to be made aware of that. Back several years ago now, 3 years ago, we went through a process of trying to, and then we are there today where we have every school reporting and operating on the same software, financial software. It's been bigger than that because it's software that affects the counting of students, the number of courses, and a whole variety of activities. We've literally had to retool the entire system. That's taken a long time. But we've to a point now where we're putting it to a test. And I think one of the results is this, and we've given you the numbers, and it's something that I'm awfully proud of. If you look nationally, over the last several years, enrollment in the two-year college systems across the country has declined consistently every year. But if you look at the state of Alabama and the community college system, the enrollment has increased every year. Now, the question may be why? Well, it is a question why, because we've gone from looking at things as the whole and looking at the big bottle and saying what's wrong, to begin talking about the individual students, the citizenry of a community, and the particular community. We've gone to an environment where we have software that is available for us for each of our schools. They can look at any part of their district and determine what do we need to do to reach the population who is not utilizing the opportunity to improve themselves so that they can be more competitive in the world of education and or in the world of securing jobs and making a living wage. We're making progress of significance in that, and that's why our enrollment continues to increase. The other part of it, it's also increasing because we are enrolling more and more students that look at what is offered and says to themselves, I can go there for a short period of time. It may be 6, 9 months, whatever the number may be. It doesn't necessarily lead to a 4-year degree, but what it does is leads to being certified that you can perform a certain job and you can go to the job market and be in a position to make a living wage. And at the same time, we can say to you, if you go through this successfully in the future, if you choose to pursue a degree, we can assist you in that process as well. So I think we've gotten more diligent at looking at the individual situation. You know, I'm constantly confused. I see all the time where we are bragging about our low unemployment. That's not a key to our problem. Our problem is the participation, the labor participation. And we stay on the bottom as a nation, in the nation, on labor participation until someone wakes up and begins to realize we have to be more specific and more detailed and do the kinds of things that we are doing in the community college system. I'm not telling you we have all the answers, but I am telling you we are pursuing a process so that as we move forward, we begin to identify individuals, households that need the help. And then we have a bank of people that work a telephone and our other means of communication, and we are dealing directly with the people who need to take advantage of the opportunities offered in that community. We're doing something else that's unique. We are meeting with the associations across this state, and we're saying, what is it that you need an employee to be able to do? We don't have a curriculum like that. You work with us. We will put people with you, and we will develop a curriculum so that someone can go through the process. We can know what they need to understand and know how to do in order to be employed by you. And we're doing that, and you funded that 2 years ago. You funded the start of this 2 years ago. You increased that funding the last year, and we're looking for an increase because I really believe this. I really believe if we as a state can find a way to get more specific and understand that we need to know that Joe and Susan and Anthony and whatever the name of a child is, need this kind of help in reading and writing and arithmetic, instead of just knowing that the school scored low or the system scored low. We need to begin to address how do we provide a prescription so that every community can move forward as they improve in the skills in education. So that's the basis of what we're doing, and that's the real reason that our enrollment has increased. So I just think that's so important, and it's so meaningful for our staff to be working that way and working in detail. And I will tell you now, if you think it's easy, we have people who've been teaching academic programs and working towards someone getting a degree so they can transfer to a four-year school and get a four-year degree and maybe not know what they want to do after that. It's not easy to change a lot of that attitude. But we want to identify what is it that the student who enrolls in our school really needs to know what to do and how to do it so they can be successful in pursuing a career. That helps small business. You know, we all get excited when we have big business come to town. They hire the small business best workers in most cases. How do you replace that worker is a serious, serious question in this state. And we must begin to pursue. And we feel an obligation that is part of our responsibility to continue that process and see that that process grows and serves every community. So I just want you to be aware, it's not just by good chance that our enrollment is increasing. It's because of a change in attitude about what we are telling a student, what we're telling parents, and what we are saying, if you will come, this can happen.
Mr. Chairman, can I say something? I want to say that I've never heard you give a better presentation, opening presentation, because I think you were spot on about the workforce issue in our state. I think that's the biggest need we've got. I made the comment last week, and it's no disrespect to higher ed, because they definitely play an important role in our state, but we're talking all the time about college, career, workforce. I think you ought to reverse that. I think it needs to be workforce, career, college. And I think that what you've identified as the most important issue we've got is the workforce. And I think going to the communities and finding out from the businesses what they need, what those skills are, and meeting that is very, very important. And like you say, matriculates all the way down to the K through 12 system, what we do there. I just appreciate it. I hope that focus continues, and whatever we can do to support that, I encourage our members to do that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I will assure you we're going to continue doing that. It is a timely process because there just aren't, the curriculum for a lot of the training just is not there, and we have to develop that curriculum. The business community has been super in stepping up and helping us do that. The other part that I think is interesting, like, for example, heavy equipment operators. There's no way we could ever afford to hire, pay, buy enough heavy equipment to do all the training. But the vendors and the businesses that are going to hire our people that are trained have been more than willing to step up and say, look, we will work with you and we'll help you develop a curriculum, and then we'll see that there is a way and a resource for the training. And I think they've been willing to do that. We just, as a community of educators, just hadn't stepped that far forward. And I just think it's a big difference. That was my opening statement, I think. But no, seriously, I just think of everything I can tell you, that may be the most important thing that I want you to understand, because I believe it is a game changer for this state. And I really believe that. You have to excuse me. I had 3 or 4 different approaches I was going to use, and I'm struggling now after putting it all into one. But another thing that I sometimes I don't think people understand this. We have, in the course of a year, a school year, we touch about 155,000 students. I believe my numbers may be correct or close to correct. That may be more students than all the 4-year colleges combined. That's a lot of people. Now, there are a lot of part-time students. There's a lot of full-time students. But the other part of that, most of those students are Alabama students. They live here. They're going to stay here. And that also makes a big difference. Now, I'm not trying to run a campaign against anybody. Don't read that this way. But what I'm interested in and concerned about is the labor force that is not stepping up and is not there to help the small businesses in this state, which realize without those, we still would be in terrible state of affairs. So I just want you to know that this is a major, major operation. We have gone through a lot of transition. We've gone through a time period where it would take me sometimes 3 or 4 years to ever get to the bottom of a financial mess at a school. And I shouldn't be talking about that, but you need to know that. We are moving forward in a direction so that, and I won't ever forget this, I was a superintendent of a city school system at one time, my first career. Then I was superintendent of a county system. When I went to the county, they had not been audited in over 3 years. Didn't make any sense to me. My CPA firm in my city school system gave a financial report every 3 months. I just think we have to get more serious, and we now have gone through the transition. We are not there, but we are so close to being in a position of having a quality program with current financial audits that will make the examiners of public accounts and the comptroller and the finance director and everybody else happy. I've lived with that myself in the past years, and I understand that problem. But we're moving in a direction so that I will be in a position to say, we know where every school is, we understand the financial situation of every school, and we can attest that it is appropriately managed. That's a goal that I think is important, and it's not something that has been of utmost importance at the community college level. Many of our schools do great jobs, but we've had a number that did not do the job that it should have done throughout the process. So I just want to make a report on that as well.
All right. It looks like you're looking for the exit. Do we have any questions, any burning questions before Chancellor Baker steps down? Any member, anybody? I don't see any hands. I want to echo what Chairman Garrett said. I'm most impressed with your focus on those people that could be working that aren't working, and how do we get our workforce participation rate up. And I think the community college system can certainly provide an access point to onboard those people who are not participating in the workforce today. And appreciate your willing to visit that issue and try to help address that issue, because as we know, with our very, very low unemployment, we need every worker in Alabama working that can work. And appreciate your system's willingness to do that. Appreciate the job you and your presidents and staff and administrators all do across the state. Chairman Garrett, any closing comments?
We got here late. Did you introduce who's with you today, your guest?
I don't even know who all's with me.
Well, behind you there, looks like a nice group.
I'm halfway handicapped.
Yeah.
Well, I see a lot of presidents out there, and know they're here to support the request, and thank you for bringing them. And
could I take that?
Sure.
Just express, for the first time in many, many years, not just my career, but in many, many years, we have an excellent president at every one of our colleges that is working with every community. And that is a difference maker throughout the system.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Chancellor Baker, and thank you for all that you and the ACCS are doing. We'll move into Mr. Fulford and the Legislative Fiscal Office giving their annual report. at this time that we've grown accustomed to. I think there may be some handouts coming your way as we go through PowerPoint, which is available online right now. If those of you want to follow in the audience or the sound of my voice on your computers, you can do so. Thank you. All right, Mr. Fulford, are you ready?
Yeah.
You gonna take a selfie of yourself? Is that? We're proud of you. I'm sure your wife is too.
No, nobody wants to see that for sure.
Okay. All right. The microphone is yours.
All right, a little housekeeping stuff to start with. You should have already received, everyone should have received, every member should have received a budget fact book for 2023. This looks like this. It's a little white publication that we produced to try to give you some background information about all the state agencies and the budgets. If you have not received your copy, please let us know and we'll try to make sure that you get that. Also, as I speak, as Senator Orr mentioned, the presentation is on our website, as well as the newest version of the tax guide is also out there today. And the latest edition of the tax expenditure report is being put online today. We will not get the latest tax incentive reports until after the second legislative day. So those will be updated as we get the information. So here we are. I think there was a article earlier this week about the challenges that you've got facing. You know, a lot of those have dollar figures attached to them, and that's exactly right. This is an astronomically different time that we're dealing with right now with our economy in Alabama as well as nationwide, and understand that it's something that can't continue at the rate that it's been going. So labor market, U.S. labor market in January added 517,000 jobs compared to an average of 401,000 jobs in 2022. Now that sounds great, and it is, except for one thing, that indicates that the Fed has not been successful in slowing down the economy like they've been trying to do with the rate increases that they've been doing over the last few months. The seasonally adjusted unemployment rates is still hovering around 3.4% for the U.S. Alabama's rate is below that. 5.7 million unemployed. Here's the big key, and it will drive a lot of the discussion that I've got. National labor shortage, and actually some of the information that Dr. Baker presented. There is a national labor shortage. There are more jobs than there are available people to fill those jobs. Employers are struggling to fill those jobs and are willing to pay whatever they can reasonably support to fill the jobs. Labor force participation rate is at 62.4% in the U.S., and the employment to population ratio is 60.2% in January. Those figures haven't changed a lot since early 2022, and that's important because they have not even gotten back to the pre-pandemic levels. So, and then there's a total of 5.3 million people that would like to work, but they are not in the workforce right now because they're not actively looking, or they couldn't take a job right now for whatever reason. This is important. So when their labor market is tight, what happens is there's increased inflationary pressure on wages. This is a chart that goes back to 1997 forward. It is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Look at the growth in wages since the pandemic, approaching and exceeding 6% growth in wages. I tell this story a lot, and you're going to hate me for it, but you know, every time I go to McDonald's and see the help wanted sign, and the wages they're offering is in the $12 to $13 an hour for a line worker, that's astronomically above any discussion about minimum wage. Now, you haven't heard anybody talk about minimum wage recently, simply because there's no need to, because they can't pay minimum wage right now and get the employees to work. So that's an important thing, and that will absolutely have an impact on the economy as we continue to have a tightening in the labor force. Another thing that's important to know is that people have been spending down excess savings. So when the economy slowed down during the pandemic in January 2020, there was basically no excess savings. As the pandemic came on board and started impacting the economy, and the economy was shut down and people could not spend on items that they wanted to, it built up excess savings to the tune of roughly $2.4 trillion. Those monies are still in some extent circulating through the economy, but they haven't actually spent down all of that excess savings. So people are still willing to spend, but it's spending related to excess savings as well as the increase in wages that they're receiving. Real GDP. So I think there was some discussion earlier in 2022 when we have 2 negative growth quarters in a row about a recession. But no economist was willing to go there yet, simply because the labor market and the GDP were not talking together. The tight labor market, low unemployment were at historically low rates, but GDP was in the negative category. Those two things don't generally go in opposite directions. But real GDP for the fourth quarter, 2.7%, according to February's second estimate. Following an increase of 3.2%, understand that some of that decline in growth was related to reduced growth in consumer spending. That's important because 67% of GDP is related to consumer spending. So as consumers spend through that excess savings of $2.4 trillion, consumer spending will decline to the point of getting back to a more normal rate over the incoming months. But the Fed has not been successful so far in slowing down to any extent inflation. 2021 annual rate of inflation was 7%. It would only moderated down to 6.5% in 2022. That means even with all the rate increases that have happened since March of 2022, there's been very little impact on the overall year-over-year inflation situation. That's really important. Target inflation rate is 2%. Don't know that they're going to hit 2% anytime soon. There's just too much other things going on out there that would prevent that from happening. But eventually they are going to slow the economy, i.e. there will be a recession at some point in time and over the next year, supposedly, according to the economists that we talk to. But understand, those economists can't make their models do what the economy is showing them that is going on. In other words, with the labor market and GDP and everything not talking to each other, and the uncertainty with regard to supply chains and the labor force, they can't tell their models to produce the numbers that they want the model to produce, which is kind of daunting. I spent most of my weekend and over the past couple of weeks trying to figure out which way was up with regard to revenue estimates. It's an interesting time, to say the least. So I wanted to point this out to you. I know there's a lot of lines on here. Look at the bright blue line in 2022. This is a chart that reflects a survey of National Federation of Independent Businesses, as well as Moody's Analytics came up with this chart. That bright blue line that's above everything else is the thing that they're most concerned about as of the end of 2022, and that is inflation. And it continues to be the such, followed by the labor quality. So those are two things that are hitting everybody right now, and certainly something that the businesses are concerned about. But I did want to also point out that they're not exactly concerned about poor sales. That other blue line that's pointing south right above the 2022 is their level of concern about poor sales. So they're concerned about inflation, they're concerned about labor quality, but they're not as concerned about their sales declining over a period of time. This is just what I mentioned. The Fed's been increasing interest rates at the highest rate since 1980s. And despite slowing down the monthly increases in inflation, they have not slowed down the annual increases in inflation to get it down to their target of 2%. More evidence needs to give confidence that they've got inflation under control before they'll stop that. The economists that we talk to say that that's possibly going to happen in the latter part of 2023. And if they're successful in that, interest rates should start going back down sometime middle of 2024. And that's important. And I'll tell you why in terms of general fund in just a minute, but it is important. So Alabama's economy, we followed suit in terms of historic unemployment, low unemployment. We've got a large labor force, larger than we've ever had. Very few number of people that are unemployed, roughly 60,000. But again, those are the people that are actively looking for a job that don't have a job. That doesn't include people that are out of the workforce that could be in the workforce. That's a different chart I'll show you in just a second. So over the year job growth of 2.7% is one of the highest job growth rates over the last 20 years, excluding the period immediately after the pandemic recovery. So this is telling for Alabama's workforce, and I think Dr. Baker hit on this. We've got more job openings, which are roughly over 6% of the available jobs are open right now, and our unemployment rate is hovering below 3%. So those two things don't necessarily align with each other, being able to fill the open positions. And some of that could be alleviated again with the labor force participation issue that Dr. Baker mentioned. And I know Representative Garrett talks about that quite a bit. So right now our labor force participation rate, this is a chart from the St. Louis Fed. Our labor force participation rate is 56.8%. For context, and you can't really see it there, but the shaded areas on that graph or on that chart are recessionary periods. That shaded area, the bigger shaded area between 2007 and 2009 was the Great Recession period. We had a larger labor force participation percentage at that point in time than we got now. We had over 60% labor force participation during the Great Recession, and right now we're sitting at 56.8. That's really important as you guys try to identify ways to get the employees back into the workforce and addressing some of the job openings that are out there. So again, I hit on this briefly. You've heard me say this over and over again. I just had to take the opportunity to say it again. 2022 and 2021 were astronomical growth years on the Education Trust Fund as well as the General Fund. What drives the growth in the General Fund right now is simplified seller's uses, one, interest on state deposits, and the insurance premium tax. That is the largest revenue source of the General Fund right now. And so 8.44% growth in the General Fund, $216 million in 2022. This is a chart that shows you the General Fund revenue growth since 2001. The average on that since 2011, after the Great Recession, is 4.71%. So 8.44%, 11. You see, those are well above what the average growth in revenues would have been. Some of that is aided, obviously, by the federal assistance that's been provided in Alabama over the last several years in response to COVID. To put that in context, we have received in total available federal grant funds of about $18 billion, including the state and local fiscal recovery money, the coronavirus relief fund money, and the ESSER money to the K-12 schools and the higher education money. We've also received another $35.7 billion on top of that in federal grant assistance for other programs, water and sewer programs, food assistance programs, other programs. I'll talk a little more about that in a little bit, but to some extent, those things have been driving or have been a driving force on both the General Fund and the Education Trust Fund over the past couple of years. There's the condition of the General Fund as it ended 2022. $515 million ending balance. That's a little misleading in that includes reversions that were in turn reappropriated. So the real number on that is somewhere around $350 million in cash. Education Trust Fund is the same way. You've heard me say this, and you'll hear me say this over and over and over again. If you want to know what's going on in the Education Trust Fund, if you want to know what's going on in the economy in general, it's income and sales. So income and sales revenues are coming in positively. The Education Trust Fund growth will be positive growth. And actually, over the past couple of years, it's been growing at rates far exceeding what the average growth rates have been. The $1.77 billion in revenue growth, 20.5%, almost all of that's related to income and sales taxes. And it most likely will always be the case because those are the two revenue sources. Number one, they're the two largest revenue sources of the state. They're also the two largest or the two revenue sources that will respond immediately and quickly to changes in the economic conditions. This chart I like to show that basically tells you exactly what I just said in terms of the 20.5% growth rate is so far above what an average growth trend would tell you it should be, that it's just almost not worth talking about, except for the fact that that growth period from 2020 to 2022, if you had a growth line that was based on average growth, compare that to actual growth over that period, we're sitting at $2.6 billion ahead of what average growth would tell us we should be. And that's something to keep in mind as you're talking about what to do with excess monies, how to maintain operations in state government. I saw Representative Garrett quoted in an article earlier this week, it couldn't be a better statement at this point in time, and I was glad to see you say it, in that in his private world, sometimes they made the worst decisions when things were going great. That's a challenge that all of you are going to be faced with in this session, and dealing with some of the excess revenues, as well as trying to figure out what a normal situation looks like going forward, because this isn't normal. We're going to get back to a normal pattern at some point in time, but none of the economists seem to agree on when or where that might happen. Every time I talk to economists all over the U.S., trying to gauge their sentiment on things, and some of them definitely say there's going to be a recession. Some of them say, well, we think it looks like there may be a recession, don't really know when, and some are just saying, well, maybe there's a recession coming, but here are 3 different ways it may look like. Well, that doesn't help me at all, right? You know, if we could pinpoint exactly when it was going to happen, that would be great, but we can't. But just know that there's a reckoning coming, and in essence, we don't assume that it's going to be a negative growth recession right now, simply because of where we are. We're 20% above, 20% average above growth, which is about 17% above average. So there's room there for things to normalize and get back down to a more normal situation. Again, what I told you earlier in terms of increases in wages over the period because of the tight labor market absolutely had a direct impact on withholdings payments. If you want to know what's going on in the economy, withholdings payments will tell you a more direct impact or more quick impact than some of the other gauges that you look at, because it comes directly out of people's paychecks. We haven't seen a growth exceeding 10% since 1984. It was 10.47% in 2022. It's not 10.47% right now. It's moderating back down, which is the story I wanted to try to tell you about the whole situation right now. Average growth or growth month to month has started to come back down, as opposed to the 20% ending growth that we had last year. We're seeing monthly growth numbers coming back down to a more normal trend versus where they have been. But you see the gross sales tax numbers are far elevated above what trend would tell you they would be. Same thing on individual income tax numbers, and corporate numbers as well. So everything is far above what growth trends would normally tell you they should be. So there's the condition of the ETF at the end of 2022. I hear a lot of people talking about the 2.7 billion ending balance. In essence, it's 2.8 because of what hasn't been reappropriated so far, but 2.8 billion in cash. And there's one of your challenges. So in 2023, this is total appropriations. I won't spend a great deal of time on this. $2.74 billion appropriated from the general fund, 8.26 from the Education Trust Fund so far, 4.5 billion in other state funds, and then total state funds of $14.6 billion. That's just a rundown of where the general fund money goes, or where it was appropriated this year. Roughly 50% of that total goes to Medicaid and corrections. Those numbers are going to change. Understand, with the expiration of the enhanced FMAP money over the next few months, Medicaid is going to need increases in general fund operating money. We've been able to basically underfund them with general fund money over the past couple of years because they have had the enhanced FMAP money to be able to offset that. Their request, I think, is in the $65 million range, as they stated when they were here. That's a number that is going to continue to increase over the next few years. Same thing for CHIP. That's an obligation that we'll assume back to some extent this year versus the past couple of years as well. Education Trust Fund, again, $5.6 billion to K-12 is 68% of the money. Higher Ed got $2.12 billion is 26%. There's your split of that appropriation. So what's the outlook for 23 and 24? My story is this. The economists are telling me, and that's where I'm going, is 2023 for the rest of the year is going to look a little slower than what it has up until this point. And then into 24 will rebound slightly. But again, if you made me swear on a stack of Bibles that that's what's going to happen, I wouldn't do it, because I can't tell you right now that it'll be in 23, it'll be in 24. I can tell you that things are looking like there's a slowdown coming, and I'll just caution you to take that into consideration when you talk about what you want to spend in the coming fiscal year and addressing the needs in education as well as your general fund agencies. So condition of the general fund, and again, I do want to point this out. You see a blank down there for supplemental appropriations in 2023. I have no idea what you plan to do in terms of supplemental appropriations. I will say this. This is like a teeter-totter. On one side of the teeter-totter is fiscal year 2023. On the other side is 2024. As you add spending to 2023, it reduces available in 2024. That's kind of how it works. So you have available cash of roughly $300 million after the $56.5 million conditional appropriations were released. But to some extent, I expect you to have a supplemental appropriation bill to spend some of that remaining 467. I don't know at this point in time what that's going to be, so I can't factor that in until you do it, because you have the likely situation or the unlikely situation that you won't do any. And then, I would have told you you've got less money to spend and you could have more money to spend. So anyway, that's entirely up to you as far as how you do supplemental appropriations in 2023. I do know that your available looking right now in 2024 is $3.36 billion. Again, that's too high, and it will be reduced by whatever you do in terms of supplemental appropriations in 2023. Things that you have to be aware of. This is obviously not all of them, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of the fact that, again, I say it again, whatever you do in supplemental appropriations will impact what you have available to spend in 2024. Inflation's a big deal. We had a series of hearings over the summer where we brought agencies in and had them tell us what kind of impact inflation is having on their operations, and it's having a big impact on their operations. For gas, everywhere from gas to troopers to food for inmates to everything across the board is being impacted by inflation. That's not just in the private world, that's in the state government world as well, because they have to buy some of the same items to run government operations that a business would. So there is a fiscal cliff coming to some extent. Please understand, this is not me guessing. It's going to happen. All the mountain of federal money that's come in over the past few years in response to COVID will run out eventually. There have been federal money used again to help offset the actual need in Medicaid over the past couple of years. They're going to need more money this year. Public health is going to need more money to cover CHIP operations. Senior Services has gotten meals money that's expiring. They're going to have money for that. Human Resources has had money to help child care workers over the past few years. And I could go on and on and on. But you understand that the asks from the general fund are going to go up exponentially over the next few years just because of a fiscal cliff situation. And matching fund requirements for programs that the Fed graciously established and gave us more money for, but then told us we had to match the money in order to get it, i.e. all the water and sewer programs under ADM and some of the transportation issues with the Department of Transportation. Corrections, you've already seen, has had an increased cost of their health care. contract, that's a big number. I think it's $30 million at least alone without dealing with anything related to staffing or construction cost. And then just across the board, your state agencies have staffing shortages that are really concerning right now. It's hard to find anybody, to be honest with you, much less somebody that wants to work for the state. That's just the point. And then the SEI, the State Employees Insurance Board, has asked for a big increase in funding. That's because they haven't asked for an increase in a while, and simply they needed some funds. I don't think that we're going to, the request is going to be fully provided, because it was a big request. It was a $225 per person a requested increase to the employer, which would have been about $69 million in cost. Again, only about 30% of that is covered by the general fund, but that's a big ask at one time. And so there's something to pay attention to going forward. Education Trust Fund, same story, and actually more direct impact. So we're assuming, again, slower growth for the rest of the year. It doesn't take many months of slow growth on the Education Trust Fund to have a major impact on the bottom line. Again, those income and sales are the biggest components of your Education Trust Fund, and they will respond quickly when things start turning down. Your total available funds in 2023, $13.5 billion. Again, same story as on the general fund. I did not assume that you were going to spend any or some of the beginning balance. I have no idea what your plans are for that. We will adjust these figures accordingly as we get into the process and we have supplemental appropriation bills before you. Just know that there's an availability of about $2.8 billion. Been lots of ideas discussed about what to do with some of that money openly and in the press. But I didn't assume that you had spent any of it, because you haven't spent it until you do. Right. So that's why there looks like there's a $5 billion ending balance, because I haven't assumed that you spent any of the supplemental yet. The available in 2024 is misleading. You can only spend either to the cap or the lower of the average of the estimated revenues. That number that you see on there and that chart is below what the fiscal year appropriation cap would be. And I'll show you that in a minute. So you've got funding issues as well in the Education Trust Fund, and the fiscal cliff may be as relevant, if not more relevant there than it is in the general fund. Dr. Mackey came to budget hearings and told you about the $3.28 billion in ESSER federal assistance that the LEAs are trying to spend before 2024 for the most part, according to their website. Through December, I think they had expended $1.2 billion of that. So there's still quite a bit of money, over $2 billion, that the K-12 schools have to spend in roughly a little over a year's time. That's going to be hard to do. And then the other thing that you need to understand, a lot of that money is being used on salaries and benefits for people, which causes you problem in terms of going forward. A lot of the LEAs cannot support those people from local money. There will be an ask, believe me, coming forward to you, 24, 25 mostly, to replace some of that money, because, you know, obviously everybody's still looking for people, and we have teacher shortages and all the like, but you're going to have a big ask to try to support some of these local projects with state money. But that's been identified in the budget document for the past couple of years. We kind of foreshadowed and knew that was going to be a situation when we got to this point, but it's absolutely going to happen. Again, use of your excess money and supplemental appropriations are going to drive what you have available to you. How you invest those would be certainly something to keep in mind. Inflationary costs. Most of your schools are still sitting on some bond money and other capital project money and having trouble spending it because of inflation. What they thought was going to cost one amount is now going to cost something else. And so there's a question of whether they can even finish a project that they started out. So that's something to keep in mind. And ongoing investments. You've made some serious investments into education over the past few years. Some of those are going to require continued investments of money. These are just some of those. The TEAMS program, the new salary matrix, the Literacy Act, and the Numeracy Act. And there are several other things I could put onto that, but those are things to keep in your mind when you decide how much money that you're going to be spending in 2024. Teacher and other staff shortages also are a big thing. So Education Trust Fund Rolling Reserve Act, I won't spend too much time on this. Rolling Reserve accomplishments. Establish a process to try to minimize the likelihood of proration by capping the annual growth in spending. Basic cap formula, you start with, this is outlined in the law. You start with the prior fiscal year receipts, you add average growth over the last 15 years, drop the lowest year, and then add or subtract non-recurring revenues. You can appropriate less than the cap, keep that in mind, but you can't spend more than the cap. And since that law's been in place since 2013, you've had no proration, which is a very big accomplishment and something you should be proud of. So what else did the act do? It provided you an ability to repay the obligations to the rainy day account, and that has been done. You establish a process to deal with excess revenues when you spend to the cap. And you also established a reserve fund that was automatically filled up with leftover money when you spent to the cap. In other words, excess revenues, a percentage of it wound up going into the reserve fund. That money can only be used to offset proration. I'll get back to that in a second. But your budget stabilization fund balance is $560 million. It also established an advancement in technology fund that can be used to address many non-recurring expenses in K-12 and higher education. You appropriated $750 million into that fund last year that could be available for appropriation at any point in time this year. Those funds can be used for repairs and deferred maintenance, capital outlay, classroom instructional support, and again, it has to, and other items, and again, it has to be appropriated through a supplemental appropriation. What the rolling reserve doesn't currently cover, and I can speak to this simply because there were two people that have written the Rolling Reserve Act or had anything to do with the modifications to it in terms of drafting. I'm one of them, and the other person's retired. So I know what the act does and doesn't do. What the maximum balance that's allowed in the Budget Stabilization Fund currently is 7.5%. I wanted to point out that that balance, that $560 million, would not be sufficient to offset the worst case scenario proration situation you would face, which would have been back in the Great Recession. That number at that point in time, before you withdrew money from reserve funds, was roughly $1.7 billion. After transfers, it wound up being down in the $700–800 million, but still, that's above the $560 million that you've got available. And so does that need to be increased? If somebody asks me an opinion, and I'm not going to offer it, but I think it does need to increase to some extent. That's a matter for you to decide how much. But again, if the intent is to offset proration, you couldn't do it with this. You'd have to go to the rainy day account. Problem with that is, yes, it can be used to offset proration, but you got to pay it back over 6 years. So you would draw it down to offset proration only to have to pay the money back over 6 years. You're setting yourself up for another obligation that you've got to meet and keep up with. And again, the stabilization fund can only be accessed to prevent proration or for loans for natural disasters. Can't be used for anything else. So you really don't have a liquid reserve fund. Rainy day account is the same way, can only be accessed for proration. Well, we've reduced the likelihood of proration with the act itself. So is there a need for you to have another fund to be able to use for some other purposes? Starting point for cap calculation is a real problem, especially in light of the past 2 years of growth that we've seen, the starting point being the immediately preceding fiscal year's revenues. That's a problem. I just showed you that those two immediately preceding fiscal years are so much above where average growth would say that number should be, that it's going to automatically give you a number that's well above what you're spending right now without even factoring in what the growth is. So is that something that you need to look at? There's a possibility there. The 15-year growth average drops the low year, but it doesn't drop the high year. If you drop the high year, you may be able to deal with some of this, what I'm talking about, astronomical growth period. And then excess funds are not transferred into the stabilization fund or the advancement in technology fund unless you spend to the cap. Well, you haven't spent to the cap over the past couple of years, so that money winds up being your ending balance, i.e. your beginning balance. And that's why we're having a conversation about a $2.9 billion ending balance, as opposed to some of that money filtering into these other two funds or another fund if you wanted to do something about that. But again, Kurt, why are you talking about that? So I went back to the years immediately preceding the Great Recession. I said, well, what if we had a Rolling Reserve Act in place at that point in time? Would we have been able to prevent proration in the following years? The answer is no. And actually, because you had two big growth years leading into the year starting the decline, your elevated growth starting point was higher than what trend would have been. And so it would have produced a number that you didn't have any reason at that point in time not to spend to, because the previous 2 years are telling you everything's great. Sound familiar? So again, if you did that and came forward, your proration in those succeeding years following that would have been far greater than what it wound up being had you spent to that cap number. So just keep that in mind. And I'm just offering that up as just things for you to consider. I just think there are issues that the Act itself doesn't currently address. It has been successful in preventing proration up until this point. Probably a large part of that is contributed to the fact that for the most years after the Great Recession ended, we had low and slow growth until the past few years, and then we've had the astronomical growth. So it absolutely worked in the lower average growth years. So this is the cap number for 2024. And again, you will decide what you wind up spending. But the cap number is $10,940,002,398. That's following the formula that's outlined in the statute. Again, your starting point is a little problematic for this calculation in that it sets your cap at a much higher place to start from. And I did want to point out that the percentage difference in spending, if you could spend to that number, and you can't because you can only spend to the average of the two estimates, our estimates are below that cap figure. And I don't know what finance's numbers are, but they could very well be below it as well. You could only spend the average if that's what you wanted to do. But if you spent to the cap number, that'd be 32% over the current year spending. That's a large number. Again, I'll go back to Chairman Garrett's statement and that he was quoted over the weekend. I mean, you've got lots of challenges. You've got lots of opportunities too. But I would caution you to just understand that things are going to change fairly quickly. And you don't want to get yourself out over your skis, so to speak, in trying to support a growth situation that just can't be supported on an ongoing basis. So that's all I've got. I know that was a lot, but if you have any questions, I'll certainly be willing to answer them.
Well, thank you, Mr. Fulford. Talking to Chairman Garrett, we are on a tight timeline today, so those questions can come offline and individually, and we'll need to move into Finance Director, Mr. Poole, and he's got a few minutes to come on and give his assessment of where we are and revenue and other things. Thank you, Mr. Poole. Good to see you, and welcome.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, it's good to see old colleagues and friends. It's good to see some new faces in the legislature, so look forward to working with everybody. Want to recognize Kirk. I mean, Kirk does a great job. Y'all saw that in his presentation. I knew that he would provide a very thorough analysis of the state of the economy with some national trend lines, so I'm not going to try to reproduce the same, but I just, in hearing his comments, a couple of observations. One, maybe with a bit of humor. You know, you sit there and you listen to this, and is it the best of times or is it the worst of times? But, you know, it's not clear, and therein lies part of the challenge. Maybe this is a time of bounty before correction. I jotted down some of Kirk's words: fiscal cliff, recession, correction, normalize, reckoning. He also used the term teeter-tottering. I'm not sure that's a term of art, but we all understand it because these are unusual times, and there clearly are unusual circumstances that nobody can necessarily predict. but we need to prepare. And I think Kirk delivered that message well. I'll kind of touch that theme a few times, but that will be a theme in the governor's budgets as she sends them to the legislature for the legislature's consideration. But important decisions will be made. They will have lasting impacts for reasons that we all know. As I prepared my comments, the governor will present her state of the state tonight, so she will make clear some of her priorities in her comments then. I will not necessarily beat her to the punch on that today, and she will, in short order, as always, transmit her proposed budgets to you in their fullest detail, and those have not transmitted or published yet. So I will not speak to the budgets in detail. They need to be viewed in their totality. What I will focus on is some process and some general capacity comments related to the budgets that we'll transmit from the governor to the legislature. So from a process standpoint, in September, as the fiscal year is winding down and a new fiscal year approaches, our team at the Executive Budget Office, it's part of the Department of Finance, in parallel to Kirk's team at LSA and LFO, begin trying to work on revenue estimates. You see a lot of the data that goes into those estimates. Kirk presented in his presentation today. We have external consultants we rely on to try to understand economic trends, revenue trends, and produce accurate revenue estimates. Understanding those estimates are out. When we're talking about FY24 doesn't start till October. So we have a pretty long time horizon that you're trying to estimate economic circumstances, and in a turbulent time that's difficult and challenging. The fiscal year turns at the end of September, beginning of October. Certainly that's a time to review the status of the budgets, and then we begin to receive agency budget requests from all state agencies and other general budget recipients. We have meetings internally for approximately 60 days with every single cabinet agency and other agencies to hear what are their needs, what are their requests. They submit those formally, and then we have discussions related to those. So it is a time-consuming process, but certainly is appropriate relative to the issues at hand. In terms of revenue estimates and economic assumptions, as Kirk pointed out, Alabama's unemployment rate is 2.6%, below the national rate. There are a lot of other factors that are driving Alabama's economy right now that I think he pointed out that are otherwise self-apparent. So I won't go into great detail on those, but just want to point out the growth trends also. The state general fund, FY22 growth was 8.44%, well above average. 22 was an anomaly. You look across the line, you see the same in the ETF at 20.54%. So far out of normal historic trend, it's hard to even imagine that. FY23 estimates I didn't include in this slide, but I'll reference them on the general fund, were 3.02% for the current year that's underway, and on the education side, 0.83. So you see, we're really beginning when we were estimating last year the 23 numbers, foreseeing some flattening on the education side, particularly both budgets as well. FY24 estimated growth rates will come in from the Finance Department at 0.16 for the general fund, so essentially flat year over year. Now that's not spending, that's receipts. Okay, so let's distinguish revenue from appropriations. FY24 for the ETF at 3.81%. And I'll pause there and kind of highlight a comment that Kirk made. We are beginning to see moderation and slowdown of growth, particularly in ETF receipts, particularly in income and sales tax. He highlighted multiple times how significant of drivers those are for the budgets. I, for one, think we're seeing national trends begin to take hold. We're starting to maybe see the first indicators in our income and sales tax receipts as a moderating factor in terms of the education budget. The general fund budget, total proposed FY24 spending in the governor's proposed general fund will total approximately $2.7 billion, and that will represent an 8.42% spending increase over FY23. Again, I continually distinguish year-over-year receipts increases from spending increases. Those are very different points of analysis, and want to make sure certainly the listening audience understands that as well. But And the basis of that is receipts growth has substantially outstripped spending growth. We've passed conservative budgets in the state of Alabama for several years, much to your credit. Consequently, as receipts growth has outstripped spending growth, there is capacity in the budgets relative to those comparisons. What we are going to really aim for in both budgets, so you'll hear some redundancy in this comments, are trying to find one-time needs, one-time spending needs. We will be focused substantially on debt reduction, making sure we have adequate reserves in both budgets. You heard Kirk's comments related to that as well, and I fully support the same. And where are some one-time spending? We know that we don't want to create recurring obligations that are unnecessary that we may not be able to sustain going forward, particularly recognizing on that both budget sides, federal spending that's going to wind down relative to the pandemic. And we're going to see that in substantial areas in both budgets. So again, increase reserve funds, target sustainable agency operational increases, target any one-time capital needs that do not require some recurring obligation. We'd really like to aim at deferred maintenance as opposed to new square footage as a general matter that would require additional operational funding necessary in the future. We will address state employee compensation. We will, as Kirk mentioned, address the SEIB rate increase. We've been working hard to determine where that number should fall as it relates to the rate. Certainly the legislature should and will have a substantial interest in that discussion as it enters the domain of the legislature. Kirk mentioned, Medicaid and corrections needs have a healthcare contract and corrections that's going to substantially increase their annualized costs. On Medicaid, we're going to see FMAP wind down as the pandemic emergency ceases, so we know. And Kirk said it well. I'll kind of copy him. We've really underfunded Medicaid for a couple of years because the federal stimulus money was underpinning that. That's going to come to an end. So we have increases, particularly in Medicaid and corrections. And then all agencies have experienced inflationary costs, whether that's gas for troopers, supplies for the state agencies. We all know what's happened with inflation. State agencies are not necessarily immune to that. On the education side of the budget house, for FY24, the governor's budgets will propose a top line spending level of $8.79 billion in the direct budget. That is a 6.5% increase over FY23. Again, it's very important to distinguish spending increases from receipts increases on a year-over-year basis. Those are incredibly distinct and need to be noted in all analysis. In terms of priorities, there has been discussion of a tax rebate. That will be a priority. Retiring debt, capital projects targeting particular K-12 needs and higher education. Again, looking for one-time investments, preferably deferred maintenance, although that's not an absolute statement.